You may already know that political gatherings often draw large crowds, sometimes in inappropriate locations because of space to accommodate crowds. Something like this happened during a Trump rally, and the attendees quickly learned a harsh lesson they won't soon forget. Join us as we recount the story of how a grizzly bear attacked the supporters and what unfolded afterward. The air was thick with anticipation in the Rocky Mountains one fateful afternoon. At the heart of the wild mountain landscape, hundreds of people gathered for a political rally that had drawn fervent Trump supporters from surrounding regions. American flags fluttered in the crisp mountain breeze, punctuated by the rhythmic chants of the crowd. Signs like "Make America Great Again," bearing slogans of loyalty to the former president, waved with intensity, their messages clear and divisive. The makeshift stage, adorned with banners and large speakers, amplified the speeches that echoed across the mountainside. Voices called for a return to certain ideals, railing against policies that, to many here, represented an infringement on their freedoms. The event, meant to be a show of solidarity, also attracted opposing views. Off in the distance, a smaller group had gathered, their protests drowned out by the sheer volume of the rally, but visible enough to further stir the embers of division among the crowd. Food trucks lined the edges of the open area, offering hot dogs, burgers, and sugary treats. The smell wafted through the cool mountain air, mingling with the scent of pine and dirt. But what no one noticed at first was that this enticing smell did more than draw hungry rallygoers toward the concession stands. In the thick forest that bordered the event, another creature had taken notice, a grizzly bear, driven from its natural habitat by encroaching human activity and lured by the irresistible scent of food. The grizzly had wandered close, hidden at first by the dense trees and underbrush, its curiosity piqued by the strange cacophony of sounds. Unused to such disturbances in its otherwise quiet mountain home, the bear became agitated, its senses overwhelmed. It wasn't long before the animal broke through the tree line, stepping cautiously onto the outskirts of the rally. At first, only a few people noticed the massive predator, its hulking form moving through the brush. Then someone screamed, their panicked voice slicing through the noise of the rally like a knife. What followed was chaos. The chants and cheers turned to gasps of horror as the bear advanced toward the concession stands, drawn by the smell of fried food. People scattered, knocking over tables and chairs in their desperate attempts to flee. The bear, spooked by the sudden commotion, rose onto its hind legs and roared, a sound so deep and primal that it seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. Panic spread like wildfire, with attendees pushing and shoving, their political differences momentarily forgotten as survival instincts kicked in. Amid the uproar, a woman by the name of Dr. Evelyn Monroe remained still, her eyes fixed on the animal. Dr. Monroe, a wildlife biologist, had come to the rally out of personal curiosity, more interested in observing the human interactions than in participating in the political fervor. But now, her professional expertise has become crucial. She knew that grizzlies were unpredictable, especially when agitated. The bear wasn't here to attack, but the chaos of the crowd could turn a tense situation into a deadly one in an instant. Her mind raced through the possibilities, how to calm the bear, how to prevent more injuries, how to navigate the panic. With slow, deliberate movements, she began to make her way toward the bear, scanning the crowd for help. Her eyes landed on a man, a Trump supporter, standing frozen in the middle of the chaos. His name was Frank Kavanaugh, and he was one of the event's most vocal participants. He had spent the afternoon passionately defending his beliefs to anyone who would listen. Now, however, his eyes were locked on the grizzly, fear rendering him motionless. Frank's loyalty to the cause had brought him here, but at this moment, those beliefs seemed distant and insignificant compared to the immediate danger at hand. Survival instincts warred with his desire to remain composed, but as the bear took another step closer, the decision was made for him. He turned to run, but his feet faltered, and he stumbled over the debris of fallen chairs and banners. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the excitement of political debate, but from sheer terror. Dr. Monroe reached him just as he regained his footing and advised him to stay calm. Together, they backed away slowly, trying to avoid drawing the bear's attention. But the crowd's panic was infectious, and it wasn't long before more people began to scream, their fear rippling through the crowd like a breaking wave. At the same time, a local ranger named Jake Thornton was making his way through the chaos. He had been stationed nearby, prepared to manage the rally in case of any disruptions, but this was beyond anything he had anticipated. As a ranger, he was responsible for both the people and the wildlife, a delicate balance that was now being tested to its limits. Thornton knew that tranquilizers weren't an option here. The bear was too close to the crowd, and any wrong move could provoke it further. His goal was to guide the bear away, back into the safety of the forest. But he needed a plan. Spotting Dr. Monroe, he moved toward her, the two locked eyes sharing an understanding of the stakes. She gestured toward the food stands as the cause. Thornton nodded, quickly relaying orders to a group of volunteers who had remained level-headed despite the chaos. Together, they began herding people away from the area, clearing the path for the bear to leave. Concession workers dumped food into large trash bags, hoping to eliminate the source of the bear's interest. It was a slow, tense process, but gradually the bear began to retreat, lured back toward the forest by the relative quiet as the crowd dispersed. Thornton and Dr. Monroe remained at the forefront, their eyes never leaving the animal until it finally disappeared into the trees. The tension in the air lingered, a fragile silence replacing the earlier uproar. The rally resumed later that day, but the mood had shifted. The incident with the grizzly bear sparked a broader conversation that rippled far beyond the mountains. News outlets picked up the story, framing it not only as a near-tragic event, but as a catalyst for a larger discussion on wildlife conservation and public safety. The intersection of politics and environmental stewardship had been made starkly clear in those harrowing moments, raising questions about how people and nature could coexist in increasingly crowded spaces. As the rally attendees packed up to leave, they carried with them more than just their banners and signs. The encounter with the bear had left a mark, a reminder that no matter how high human emotions run, the natural world remains a force that demands respect. The dense, untamed wilderness of British Columbia stretched out in raw beauty. Towering ancient trees loomed above, their canopies merging into a sea of green, untouched by human hands. The forest floor, soft with pine needles and rich earth, was a delicate tapestry of ferns, moss, and fallen leaves. Into this remote expanse ventured a group of 5 friends, eager for a weekend escape from the pressures of city life and eager to immerse themselves in nature's serenity. At the heart of the group was David, a seasoned outdoorsman with a calm, steady presence. His rugged frame and practical demeanor reassured the others that they were well prepared for whatever the wild might present. Alongside him was Lily, an environmental science graduate with a profound love for nature. She had chosen this secluded spot, far from the usual well-trodden trails. Jonathan, David's childhood friend, was more cautious, often masking his anxiety with nervous humor. Olivia, sharp and curious, had brought along her camera, intent on documenting their adventure. And then there was Ethan, always lighthearted, providing fun in any situation. They set up camp near a tranquil lake, its still waters reflecting the trees and sky above. After pitching their tents and gathering firewood, the group spent the day hiking, laughing, and basking in the sense of freedom that came with being disconnected from the rest of the world. As dusk fell, they returned to camp, content and ready for the night ahead. As darkness descended, the campfire flickered and crackled, casting long shadows across the forest. The air grew calm, and the stars, uninhibited by city lights, twinkled brilliantly above. The forest around them remained quiet, with only the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. The mood was peaceful, but as the night deepened, an uneasy stillness crept into the camp. It was Ethan who first noticed something, a low rumbling sound drifting through the trees. At first faint, it grew louder, unmistakably the growl of a large animal. David stood, scanning the tree line. A massive grizzly bear, its eyes catching the faint glow of the fire, emerged from the shadows. The bear moved slowly, deliberately, assessing its surroundings, its powerful presence unnerving the group. It wasn't charging, just stalking. For a tense moment, the group remained frozen, each aware of the fragility of their situation. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and vanished into the trees. The tension remained thick as the group quickly packed up camp, their earlier carefree mood shattered. They followed David's instructions, storing food far from the campsite and taking steps to minimize their presence. But even as they worked, a gnawing sense of unease lingered. They were no longer alone in the wilderness. The bear returned before dawn, its growls echoing through the trees. This time it ventured even closer, circling the camp with unsettling persistence. David remained calm, though the strain was evident. The bear wasn't just passing through, it was hunting. As the day wore on, tension hung in the air. Every sound seemed amplified, each rustle in the underbrush a potential threat. The group discovered tracks, deep, wide bear prints, disturbingly close to their camp. But what unnerved them further was the discovery of another set of tracks, smaller, humanoid, as if someone had been walking alongside the bear. The revelation chilled them. Something or someone was using the bear, guiding it. The bear wasn't acting alone. As the sun set again, casting long shadows over the forest floor, the group knew they were no longer simply camping. They were being hunted. Night fell, and with it came the familiar, menacing growl of the bear. This time, they knew they were facing more than just a wild animal. Something else lurked in the darkness, something far more dangerous, watching and waiting. Grim determination settled over the group as they prepared for the unknown. Whatever stalked them in the shadows, they would face it together, knowing their survival depended on one another and their will to confront the terror that had found them deep in the wilderness. In the vast and unforgiving wilderness of the Yukon, a small group of scientists had gathered at a remote research station. Their mission: to study the effects of climate change on grizzly bear populations. The rugged landscape stretched for miles in every direction, a patchwork of dense forests, jagged mountain peaks, and glacial rivers carving through the valleys. The team, led by Dr. Owen Mathers, a seasoned wildlife biologist, had been working in the area for several months. Their objective was clear: monitor the behaviors and migration patterns of the grizzly bears and understand how rising temperatures were influencing the region's ecosystem. The station, a modest outpost equipped with basic amenities and research tools, was perched on a ridge overlooking the tundra. Despite its isolation, the team had made remarkable progress in tracking and studying the bears. They used GPS collars, motion-sensing cameras, and drone surveillance to monitor the animals from a distance. For weeks, the data had been routine. Standard patterns of foraging, hibernation preparation, and territorial displays. But then the bears' behavior began to change. At first, it was subtle. Dr. Alice Crow, the team's ecologist, noticed that the bears were coming closer to the station than usual. Typically, grizzlies would avoid human settlements, but over the past few days, there had been frequent sightings just beyond the tree line. It wasn't just the proximity. The bears seemed more agitated, moving erratically, and their ordinarily predictable habits were disrupted. Several of the males, which usually spent their time in isolated territories, had been spotted together, a rare occurrence outside of mating season. At one of their daily briefings, Alice raised a critical point: the bears were coming closer. Dr. Mathers nodded in agreement as the data confirmed her observations. There had been a noticeable spike in activity near human-populated areas. This was part of a larger trend they had been tracking for years: warmer winters, shorter hibernation periods, and a decline in food sources. As temperatures rose, the bears' natural prey, such as caribou and small mammals, became scarcer. Their shrinking habitats were forcing them into new territories, and now, it seemed, they were heading straight for the research station. One evening, as the team gathered in the station's standard room, they heard a loud crash from outside. They rushed to the window and saw a massive grizzly, its fur matted and dark with mud, rummaging through their supply shed. The bear was enormous, easily over 800 pounds, and it was tearing through the steel door with a single swipe of its powerful claws. Dr. Theo Martin, the station's zoologist, stood frozen as the others hurried to secure the interior, showing concern about the intensity of the bear's aggression. Over the next several days, more bears appeared near the station, and some began to encroach further into nearby human habitats. Local villages, already dealing with food shortages of their own, started reporting similar sightings: bears breaking into homes, scaring livestock, and, in some cases, attacking people. Dr. Mathers knew they had to act. The team's research was vital, not just for understanding the impacts of climate change on grizzly populations, but for the larger picture of how these shifts would affect the entire ecosystem. Yet the safety of his team was his top priority. The team decided to set up a series of deterrents around the station. They installed electric fences, reinforced their storage units, and used noise deterrents to try to keep the bears at a distance. But despite their efforts, the bears persisted, each encounter growing more dangerous. As the days passed, Dr. Mathers and his team uncovered more alarming data. Not only were the grizzlies affected, but other wildlife populations in the area were also showing signs of distress. Species that typically thrived in the cold were struggling to survive, while invasive species better adapted to warmer climates were moving into the region. The entire ecosystem was in flux, with unpredictable consequences. One morning, while reviewing footage from one of the cameras positioned near a river, Alice made a startling discovery. The bears weren't just moving closer out of hunger, they were avoiding something. In the footage, a group of grizzlies had been foraging along the riverbank when they suddenly scattered, fleeing in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, a massive landslide crashed through the area where the bears had been. The land, once frozen solid, had thawed to the point of instability. The rapid melting of the permafrost, combined with increased rainfall, was causing the ground to shift, making the region even more dangerous. It became clear to the team that they were witnessing the first signs of a much larger environmental catastrophe. If the patterns they were seeing continued, the entire Yukon landscape could be transformed within a matter of decades. The permafrost would melt, releasing vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, accelerating climate change even further. The wildlife, already struggling, would be forced into even smaller territories, leading to more conflicts with humans. The grizzlies, once the apex predators of the Yukon, were now at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. And in trying to understand these shifts, the scientists found themselves caught in the middle of a rapidly changing world. As the team continued their work, the weight of their discoveries hung over them. Their research was more important than ever, but it came at a price. They were no longer just observers of the natural world. They were part of a delicate balance that was tipping toward disaster. Every new data point, every encounter with the bears, was a reminder that the fragile ecosystems they studied were inextricably linked to the survival of both wildlife and human communities. Standing on the ridge overlooking the vast wilderness, Dr. Mathers knew their work had only just begun. The bears' relentless presence was a warning, a sign that the world they had known was changing, and that the consequences of those changes would reach far beyond the Yukon. The challenge now was to find a way to protect both themselves and the creatures they had come to study before it was too late. The sun blazed relentlessly over the city, casting an oppressive heat that had persisted for days. The once bustling metropolis was now a simmering landscape, choked by a sweltering heat wave that had reached unprecedented levels. People moved slowly through the streets, beads of sweat glistening on their foreheads, eyes narrowed against the shimmering heat. It was a summer unlike any other, and the city, its towering buildings, endless concrete, and crammed streets, was struggling to cope. Yet amidst the daily human struggle, another creature wandered into the urban sprawl, seeking respite from the unbearable heat. A black bear. The bear had ventured far from its natural habitat in search of water and food, its instincts overriding its usual wariness of humans. Driven by hunger and thirst, it had wandered into the city's largest park, a sprawling green space that stood as an oasis among the high-rises and asphalt. The park, usually a place of leisure and calm, quickly became the epicenter of a crisis as news spread that the wild creature was roaming freely, causing panic and chaos. Ruth Henderson, a veteran park ranger, had been alerted to the bear's presence just as her day was coming to an end. She was no stranger to wildlife, but a bear in the city was something entirely new. As she drove her weathered Park Service vehicle toward the heart of the park, she couldn't help but think of the broader implications of what was unfolding. Urban sprawl has pushed farther and farther into wildlands in recent decades, and the effects of climate change have made water sources increasingly scarce. Now, animals were being forced into the city, searching for what the wilderness could no longer provide. Ruth parked near the visitors center and scanned the horizon. The bear had been sighted near the park's artificial lake, a small body of water that had shrunk significantly during the heat wave. As she approached on foot, her eyes caught glimpses of scorched grass and wilting trees. Everything was suffering under the sun's unrelenting glare. She knew the bear would be frightened, confused, and likely unpredictable, and it was up to her to ensure the safety of both the animal and the city residents. Meanwhile, across town, Dr. Matthew Collins, a local veterinarian, was working through an endless stream of dehydrated pets brought in by worried owners. His clinic had been overwhelmed since the heat wave began, and the situation was growing more critical by the hour. As he finished treating a panting dog, his phone buzzed with a notification. The local authorities were requesting his assistance in dealing with a wild bear that had appeared in the park. Matthew had spent years working with wildlife in rural areas before settling in the city, and he knew that tranquilizing and relocating a bear required precision, calm, and expertise. With a sigh, he gathered his kit, called in a favor from a colleague to cover his appointments, and headed toward the park. Not far from the park's edge, a family was also feeling the effects of the bear's intrusion. John and Lisa Reynolds had brought their 2 young children, Emma and Jake, to the park for what they had hoped would be a brief escape from the heat. But now, they were huddled together in the shade of a tree, nervously watching the frantic park staff as word spread that a bear was nearby. John scanned the tree line, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure what to do. Should they leave the park immediately or stay put and hope the situation was handled before it got out of hand? Their children, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, were restless and fidgety in the heat. Lisa tried to keep them calm, but her anxiety was growing. She could feel the collective tension of the other families gathered nearby, all of them watching and waiting for some resolution. It seemed impossible that a wild bear could be in the middle of their city, and yet here they were, hiding in plain sight from an animal that belonged in the deep forests, not the heart of urban life. As the bear wandered deeper into the park, its desperation became evident. It knocked over trash cans, tore into picnic baskets, and caused brief moments of terror as it passed too close to unsuspecting joggers or families. But it was not aggressive, merely frantic. The creature's thick black fur, meant to insulate it from the cold, was now a curse under the blistering sun. It was losing energy fast, its mouth dry, its movement sluggish. The bear's once robust frame had begun to sway with exhaustion, and still, it hadn't found the relief it needed. Back at the park's command post, Ruth was coordinating with local law enforcement, the Animal Control Unit, and Dr. Collins, who had just arrived. Time was running out. The bear was nearing a dangerous point of dehydration, and the growing crowd of onlookers was increasing the likelihood of a dangerous encounter. Ruth knew the only way to end this safely was to sedate the bear and transport it to a safer environment, but doing so in the open, crowded space would be risky. Every decision was weighed carefully: the bear's life, the safety of the people, and the broader implications of how they had all ended up in this situation. Dr. Collins quickly set up his tranquilizer equipment, his practiced hands moving deftly despite the tension in the air. He knew they had one shot to get this right. The bear had become an unintended symbol of the ecological imbalances now plaguing the city, a stark reminder that climate change and urban expansion were driving even the wildest of creatures to desperation. As the team moved into position, Ruth glanced around at the park's dwindling trees and dry grass, thinking about how the city had expanded over the years, pushing farther into areas that once supported a diverse range of wildlife. The heat wave, exacerbated by the changing climate, had only intensified the pressure on local ecosystems. The bear was just one of many signs that the balance between human development and nature was becoming increasingly fragile. The tranquilizer dart found its mark, and within minutes the bear began to slow, its movements growing lethargic until it finally slumped to the ground. The crowd that had gathered let out a collective sigh of relief, but for Ruth, the moment was bittersweet. This wasn't just about a bear in a park. It was about what the future held for the city, for its wildlife, and for the planet. As the bear was carefully loaded into a transport vehicle bound for a sanctuary far outside the city, Ruth knew this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. The bear's relocation was a temporary solution to a much larger problem. Urban sprawl, climate change, and human encroachment on natural habitats have all contributed to this moment. Unless there was a significant shift in how the city and the world addressed these issues, more wildlife would find themselves wandering lost and desperate through the concrete jungle. The incident became a rallying cry for environmental responsibility and community resilience. The bear, a symbol of survival against the odds, had brought the city's challenges into sharp focus, reminding everyone of the fragile balance that hung between civilization and nature. The air was crisp and thin as the helicopter touched down on the secluded helipad near the luxury mountain lodge. Surrounded by towering pines and capped with an early dusting of snow, the lodge was an architectural marvel designed to blend with the natural splendor of the landscape. For the team from Kleintech, this would be the backdrop for what was billed as a transformational corporate retreat. Tension lingered in the air, invisible but palpable, among the group of high-powered executives and managers as they exited the helicopter, each one engrossed in their thoughts. They were there to build something greater than the sum of their roles, or so the retreat's invitation had promised. Leading the team was Eric Williams, the COO of Kleintech. Eric had built a career on his stoic leadership and strategic insight, which made him well respected, if not universally liked. Beside him, his longtime second-in-command, Amanda Lee, VP of Operations, exuded efficiency with every step. She was precise and pragmatic, always several steps ahead in any conversation or decision. Behind them trailed David Colton, a relatively new hire and the head of Kleintech's marketing department. His youthful energy and progressive ideas often put him at odds with the more seasoned executives. Completing the group were Vanessa Patel, the ambitious head of human resources, and Andrew Meyer, the CFO, a man of numbers with a reputation for being coldly analytical. Each brought their agenda, their sense of importance, to this isolated mountaintop. The lodge, an opulent structure nestled in the wilderness, promised a break from the rigors of corporate life, with a sprawling deck overlooking a serene valley, fireplaces crackling in every corner, and a promise of both solitude and indulgence. What none of them knew, however, was that the serenity they sought was under threat. Hidden from their sight deep in the wilderness, a territorial grizzly bear roamed the area. It was an unusual occurrence for such a beast to be this far down from the higher elevations so late in the season, but circumstances had driven it closer to the lodge. The bear had sensed the presence of humans, intruders in its home, and its unease was growing. The first day of the retreat unfolded without incident. The team gathered in the lodge's main hall, with its vaulted ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the jagged peaks outside. Flip charts and whiteboards were wheeled in, and a facilitator led them through exercises designed to foster collaboration. They discussed long-term goals, synergies between departments, and strategies for the upcoming fiscal year. The conversations, though primarily cordial, were underpinned by the same competitive undercurrents that permeated their day-to-day corporate lives. As evening approached, the team gathered on the deck for a nightcap, enjoying the view and basking in the sense of accomplishment that came from a productive day. They didn't hear the low growl that echoed from the woods just beyond the tree line, where the bear, still hidden from view, lurked. The smell of food and the sounds of laughter only further agitated it. The wilderness was its domain, and these humans had trespassed too far. The following morning, the retreat moved outdoors in the form of a team-building exercise. The facilitator led them on a hiking trail that wound through the dense forest surrounding the lodge. They were divided into pairs and asked to work through various challenges along the route. Eric, paired with David, struggled to reconcile his old-school leadership style with David's youthful assertiveness. Amanda, meanwhile, worked alongside Andrew, each of them focused on analyzing problems rather than solving them together. Vanessa, the only one indeed in her element, moved with confidence through the tasks, encouraging her partner, a grumbling Eric, to see the bigger picture. Unbeknownst to them, the bear had been trailing them for hours, its presence masked by the wind and the rustling of the trees. The hikers' progress through the forest further inflamed their territorial instincts. What had started as a cautious observation turned into a calculated pursuit. The bear was watching them, learning their rhythms and waiting for the moment to strike. That night, the team gathered again in the lodge, still oblivious to the danger that lurked just beyond the walls. The fireplace crackled and glasses clinked as they unwound from the day. Conversations flowed, less formal now but still tinged with the pressures of their roles. It was during one of these lulls in conversation that Vanessa spotted movement outside the window, a dark shape just at the edge of the tree line. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she blinked, it was gone. She said nothing, chalking it up to exhaustion. Then came the attack. The first sign was a crash, a loud sound of wood splintering, as the bear charged through the side deck. It roared, a sound so primal it silenced every conversation mid-sentence. The team froze. The bear, massive and wild-eyed, reared up, dwarfing them all in its fury. It had never encountered humans so brazen in its territory, and the intruders had to be driven out. Panic swept through the group. Eric, always the composed leader, struggled to rally them, but in the face of such a visceral, immediate threat, all sense of corporate hierarchy vanished. Andrew, the numbers man, stood frozen, his mind blank in the face of something that couldn't be calculated. Amanda, ever the problem solver, tried to assess the situation, but no data points could save them now. The bear swiped at the air, its claws carving through the door frame, sending splinters flying. Vanessa, who had seen the bear first, shouted for everyone to move, her instincts kicking in faster than anyone else's. David, who had been the most aloof throughout the retreat, found himself on the front lines, grabbing a chair and trying to use it to push the bear back. It was a futile gesture, but it bought them precious seconds. They scrambled to escape, moving as a unit, stumbling over each other in the chaos. Personal grievances and corporate rivalries dissolved in an instant. There was no longer a boss, an employee, or a competitor. They were simply humans fighting to survive. The bear's fury was relentless, its attacks driven by primal instinct, but something shifted in the group. For the first time, they weren't thinking about profit margins or market shares. They were thinking only of each other. In the hours that followed, huddled together in the cold, far from the destroyed lodge, the team reflected in silence. The bear had finally retreated, satisfied that its territory was once again its own. Eric, bruised and exhausted, looked around at his team, no longer a collection of high-powered individuals, but a group bound by shared experience. They had come to the mountains to strategize about corporate expansion and growth, but instead, they were left contemplating the cost of encroaching on nature. Their values, priorities, and sense of self had shifted. The wilderness had shown them something no PowerPoint presentation ever could. That survival, both in the wild and in business, wasn't just about strategy. It was about connection, trust, and respect for the world beyond their ambitions. In the northern reaches of the continent, where the air was crisp, the forests dense, and the mountains towered like sentinels, a remote region stood in quiet majesty. This land was not just a landscape of trees, rivers, and wildlife. It was alive with the stories, memories, and spirit of the indigenous peoples who had called it home for millennia. For the members of the region, the forest was sacred. But now that sacred bond was under threat. Developers from distant cities had turned their eyes toward the region, drawn by the promise of profit. The vast forests, rich with timber and other natural resources, represented an opportunity for commercial gain. The developers saw the land as nothing more than potential. But to the people of the region, it was home, an irreplaceable living entity that was central to their culture, identity, and survival. At the heart of the unfolding battle between preservation and exploitation was an immense grizzly bear, a creature as ancient as the land itself. This bear had long been regarded as a guardian spirit. Its presence was felt throughout the forest, from the deep valleys to the high ridges, and sightings of the great bear were rare but revered. Elder Nathaniel, one of the most respected leaders of the region, understood the significance of the bear better than anyone. To him, it was more than just an animal. It was a symbol of the land's resilience, of the enduring strength of nature against the forces of destruction. Nathaniel had spent his life protecting the stories and traditions of his people, passing down the teachings of his ancestors to younger generations. But now, as the developers inched closer to defiling the land, he feared that the future of the land was in peril. The developers arrived with promises of progress, jobs, and economic growth. They spoke of modernization, of the need to move forward and embrace the opportunities that the world offered. But Nathaniel knew what that meant: the clearing of forests, the destruction of wildlife habitats, and the erasure of his people's history. To them, the land was a resource to be consumed, not a living, breathing entity to be protected. As the developers laid out their plans, tensions began to rise. Protests were organized and led by both the indigenous community and environmental activists who had come from far and wide to support the cause. Among them was Emma Cartwright, a passionate environmentalist who had spent years fighting against the exploitation of natural landscapes. For Emma, the region represented one of the last truly wild places on Earth, a place untouched by the relentless march of industrialization. Emma had been working alongside the native people, amplifying their voices and ensuring that the world knew what was at stake. She had seen firsthand the devastation that unchecked development could bring to vulnerable ecosystems, and she was determined to prevent the region from suffering the same fate. But as the developers pushed forward with their plans, even she began to feel the weight of the challenge ahead. The fight to protect the land was becoming increasingly desperate. One day, as she ventured deeper into the forest to document the impact the proposed development would have on the area's wildlife, Emma encountered someone unexpected, a wildlife photographer named Daniel Royce. Daniel had been drawn to the native region after hearing rumors of the marvelous grizzly that wandered the forest. For years, he had photographed animals in the wild, but the bear had captured his imagination like no other creature. There was something about the stories of the bear, its elusiveness, its intelligence, its almost mythical status, that made Daniel feel as though this was no ordinary grizzly. Daniel had spent weeks tracking it through the forest, observing from a distance, careful never to disturb the bear's movements. What he saw astonished him. The bear moved with a deliberate purpose, patrolling the edges of the forest where the developers had begun their preliminary work. The bear seemed to be keeping watch, aware of the intrusion into its territory, and Daniel was struck by how protective the bear appeared to be, as if he understood that something was being taken from it. As Daniel's photographs began to circulate online, drawing attention to the plight of the forest and the bear that guarded it, the developers escalated their efforts. Heavy machinery was brought in, and the first swaths of trees were felled, their towering forms crashing to the earth with a devastating finality. The noise, the destruction, the intrusion of the machines into the forest, everything disturbed the delicate balance that had existed for centuries. The bear's response was swift. It began to appear more frequently, emerging from the forest at the fringes of the construction sites. Its massive form was a haunting presence that unsettled the workers. There were reports of machinery being damaged and of workers abandoning their posts after sighting the grizzly too close for comfort. The bear's actions, though seemingly random, carried a message. This was its land, and it would not surrender it without a fight. As the bear continued to disrupt the developers' operations, the conflict reached a boiling point. The developers, frustrated by the delays and growing costs, called for the bear to be removed, even if it meant lethal force. But the native people, led by Elder Nathaniel and supported by Emma and her fellow activists, rallied together in defense of the bear and the land it protected. In the end, the bear brought the community together in a way that nothing else could. The bear, with its quiet defiance, became a symbol of resistance not just against the developers, but against the broader forces of modernization that sought to erase the natural world. It reminded the people of the region of their strength, of their deep connection to the land, and of the responsibility they had to protect it for future generations. As the media attention surrounding the bear grew, public support for the preservation of the native village swelled. The developers, facing mounting pressure from environmental groups, indigenous advocates, and the broader public, were eventually forced to abandon their plans. The forest and the bear that guarded it were spared. The bear returned to the depths of the forest, its massive form once again blending into the shadows of the ancient trees. But his legacy endured. The people had won a significant victory, not just for themselves, but for all who understood the importance of protecting the Earth's wild places. The bear had shown them that true power did not lie in machines or money, but in the land itself, in the strength of community, and in the enduring bond between nature and those who are willing to stand up for it.